The driveway was freshly power washed. I noticed it before I even stepped out of the car because that's the kind of thing my mother does when Jared comes home. I parked behind a luxury SUV that had two Betilias and sat still for a moment, watching the porch light flicker. The house hadn't changed. Same shutters, same wreath on the door, same sinking feeling in my gut. When the door opened, my father Raymond stood in his company's coming sweater. He gave me a brief, one-armed hug and said, "And quack, everyone's in the dining room." Tet croaked. We waited as long as we could. Inside, the air smelled like roast beef and old expectations. My heels clicked across hardwood as I followed him past the framed photos lining the hallway. Jared's college graduation. Jared in Tuscanany. Jared shaking hands with someone important. There was one of me too. Third grade, missing a front tooth tucked behind a plant. Elaine looked up as I walked in, smile-eyed eyes calculating it. Quote, "Lana, finally," and quote, she said, as if I'd held up a Broadway production. Et quote. "Everyone, this is my daughter. She lives in New York and works with books or something like that." Et quote, she waved a hand toward me like I was an accessory that didn't match the decor. Et quote, "Hi," and quote, I offered, stepping forward with a tight smile. Talia stood gracious and glowing in soft blue silk. Et quote, "I've heard so much about you. You're in publishing, right? That sounds fascinating. What do you do exactly?" Before I could answer, my mother laughed. "Oh, she's always been the artsy one. Something literary." "It's not like Jared's work, of course." She raised her wine glass with a smirk. "She's just creative." I bit the inside of my cheek across the table, tilted her head slightly, then glanced down into her lap. I caught the subtle movement, the unmistakable glow of a phone screen. Beneath the tablecloth, she tacked, scrolled, and paused. Her expression didn't change much, but I saw it, her eyebrows lifted just a hair, her fingers stilling. Then, quietly, she looked back, up at me with a kind of curious respect I hadn't seen in a long time. I adjusted my napkin, heart pounding. I didn't know what she'd read yet, but I had a feeling everything was about to shift. I used to think there was something noble about being unnoticed, that if I kept my head down and did everything right, someone would eventually see me. But in the Whitmore household, visibility had a very specific currency: grades, trophies, college banners, and that currency belonged to Jared. From the moment he hit his first home run in Little League, it was clear where the family's attention would go. My parents beamed at every game, screamed from the sidelines, printed his stats in Christmas cards. At 9, he got a room remodel with a sports mural. At 10, a framed poster that read, and quote, "Greatness is earned," et quote. I was 8 when I wrote my first story about a girl who could speak to birds. My teacher gave it an A+ and a gold star with the words, and quote, "Brilliant imagination," scrolled across the top. I ran home with it folded neatly in my backpack, heart beating fast. Et quote, "Mom, look what I wrote," and quote, I sat holding the pages out like treasure. She glanced at it, one hand stirring spaghetti sauce. "That's nice, honey. Put it on the counter, okay? We need to leave soon. Jared's playoff game starts at 6 o'clock. I placed it gently by the sink, expecting she'd read it later. She never did. Days later, I found it still there, stained with a coffee ring and crusted sauce on the corner. No one had turned the page. That moment settled in me like wet cement. I fix cement. When I won a poetry contest in 6th grade, I didn't even bother mentioning it until the ribbon fell out of my backpack at dinner. "You should have told us," Dad said kindly. But he was already turning to ask Jared how tryouts went. I learned not to interrupt momentum. By high school, Jared was the Golden Boy, varsity, quarterback, debate captain, national merit scholar. My parents came to every event of his with bells on. When I got published in a regional teen magazine, my mother said, and quote, "That's sweet, but have you thought about a real career?" At quote, I stopped showing them things. I kept my poems and folders under my bed. I clapped at Jared's scholarship ceremony, smiling for the camera, even though I knew my name would never be printed on the program. By the time I graduated, I had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight, and I carried that skill like armor when I boarded a one-way flight to New York. New York didn't greet me with open arms. It met me with subway delays, overpriced groceries, and a shoebox apartment with paper-thin walls. But even when the noise rattled my sleep and my paycheck barely stretched past Thursday, I felt more visible there than I ever had at home. I enrolled at a small liberal arts college in the Bronx, working shifts at a bookstore and tutoring freshman essays to keep the lights on. On weekends, I handed out flyers for a performance art group in Union Square just to afford Metro cards. I lived on peanut butter, borrowed, Wi-Fi, in the wild hope that maybe, just maybe, my voice could matter. The writing program was rigorous, but I soaked up every critique. I learned how to cut the fat from my sentences, how to find the blood beneath a pretty metaphor. A professor pulled me aside after workshop once and said, and quote, "You don't write to be seen. You write because it's how you breathe, don't stop." I didn't after graduation. I was accepted into an MFA program in Brooklyn. I got a partial fellowship and picked up night shifts at a diner to cover the rest. It was exhausting and glorious. I wrote on receipt paper between orders. I wrote in laundry rooms and under library lamps and on the fire. Escape at 3 a.m. My work started appearing in places I'd once only read, small literary journals, then bigger ones. A poem got picked up by Plowshares. An essay landed in the Atlantic. A short story about a girl whose family only remembered her birthday when she won an award made its way into a national anthology. I didn't call home when my parents did call. The conversation stayed shallow. "How's New York treating you?" "Mom, when are you giving up and coming back?" I gave vague answers, asked about Jared, and never mentioned deadlines, grants, or readings. It wasn't that I didn't want to share. It was that I knew what the silence would feel like if I did. 3 years after my MFA, my debut short story collection was picked up by an independent press. Thin Spaces received glowing reviews and a nomination for the American Fiction Prize. When I got the call, I stood in the middle of my kitchen surrounded by takeout containers and unpaid bills and wept. Then I opened my laptop and started writing the next thing. The table was dressed in crystal and china, all gleaming under the chandelier my mother insisted on polishing herself, the kind of presentation reserved for her book club, luncheons, and Jared's homecomings. I'd forgotten how stiff everything felt in this house, like the silverware might judge you if you used the wrong fork. Talia sat beside Jared, warm and gracious, filling the space with a kind of quiet charm. She asked me thoughtful questions: where I lived, if I liked New York, what kind of books I worked on. I tried to answer, but Elaine always found a way to steer the conversation back to Jared. "Oh, did you tell them about the new office, sweetheart?" she said, reaching across him to refill his wine glass. "Corner view of the city, very impressive. They're even flying him out to consult on that merger in DC. That's amazing," Talia said, genuinely beaming at him. "I'm so proud of you." I smiled politely, sipping from my glass, letting the stem cool my fingertips. "So, Lena," Talia turned back to me, "are you working on any new books right now?" I opened my mouth, hopeful. At quote, "Actually, she's always had her head in the clouds," end quote. Elaine interjected with a light laugh. At quote, "One time we practically had to pry her off the couch because she was glued to a book all summer." At quote, "But that's Lena. Very creative." At quote, she said the word like it was a flaw. Jared shifted in his seat. My father cleared his throat but didn't speak. I set my fork down slowly. At quote, "I've actually been working on." Elaine waved her hand. "Not everyone needs to be important, dear. Some people just enjoy their little hobbies." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We can't all be making partner at 33. The words landed like glass cracking beneath the weight of something unspoken. Talia glanced at me, then down at her lap again. I saw the glow of her phone, her fingers moving quietly. A pause, a flick of her thumb, then stillness. I caught the moment her eyes widened, just a flicker, and then settled into something sharper, recognition. She looked up slowly, studying me like I was someone new. At quote, "Wait, at quote," she said, cutting through the hum of conversation. At quote, "Sorry to interrupt, but are you that Lena Whitmore?" At quote, the table fell silent. Elaine blinked, confused. At quote, "What do you mean?" At quote, Talia turned her phone so everyone could see the screen. At quote, my photo, my name. A review quote. The author of Thin Spaces. She said, almost breathless. This is you, isn't it? Jared leaned over to look. My father set down his knife. I felt my breath catch, like the room had tilted and everyone was just beginning to notice. I met Talia's eyes and nodded once, quietly, carefully. Jared let out a stunned laugh and said, holy shit, Talia's voice was steady, but her eyes gleamed with disbelief as she scrolled. Lena Whitmore, author of Thin Spaces, winner of the PEN Bingham Prize, finalist for the National Book Award Gaze. Lecturer at 9U Columbia, and she glanced up at me. Stanford, the clink of cutlery stopped. Even the flicker of candlelight seemed to hesitate. My mother's laugh came half a beat too late. Oh, well, there are a lot of Lena Whites in the world. Probably just someone with the same name. Talia turned the phone toward her again. No, this is her photo bio interviews. There's even a video of her reading at the 92nd Street. Jared leaned over to see. Jesus, he muttered, his face shifting from confusion to something like awe. Why didn't you ever say anything? I did, I said quietly, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. More than once, my mother scoffed, folding her napkin. That's ridiculous. We would have remembered something like that. I took a breath, not to calm down, but to stay upright. When I got my first story published in The Atlantic, I called Dad, answered, and you said Mom was busy getting ready for Jared's tournament. You told me to send it in the mail. Raymond blinked, face unreadable. I did. You never mentioned it. A year later, when Thin Spaces came out, I sent signed copies with a note. Elaine looked at me like I'd said something vulgar. That's absurd. We never received. They were still in the guest room, unopened. I saw them at Christmas. Jared's brow furrowed. Wait, you really sent the book? I thought. I don't know what I thought. You thought I was still the girl with her nose in a notebook. I said, and maybe I still am. But now people read what's in it. There was murmuring from the other end of the table. Jared's fiancé's parents were whispering to each other, one of them clearly Googling on their phone. A distant aunt leaned toward her husband, squinting at the screen. Elaine's smile was frozen now, too. You could have been clearer about it, if it mattered that much to you. I looked at her, not angry anymore, just tired. I stopped expecting it to matter. That's the only way I could keep writing. Raymond lowered his head, eyes fixed on his plate. Jared sat back in his chair, arms crossed, studying me like he'd never seen me before. Talia reached across the table, her voice soft. Your book changed the way I think about sisters. I had no idea it was personal. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, because for the first time I wasn't the pranday, wasn't the truth. I was simply standing in it. And the silence around me was starting to sound like reckoning. Elaine's jaw was tight, her wineglass untouched now. She looked between me and Talia as if we'd conspired to humiliate her. So you wrote about us, and she said sharply, all those stories, those damaged mothers, distant fathers, that's what you've been doing all these years, turning your family into fiction. I held her gaze steady. I wrote about what it feels like to be invisible in the place that was supposed to see me first. Eve, that sounds familiar. Maybe you're recognizing yourselves at across the table? Jared sat straighter. Come on, Mom. That's not fair. Lena's not trying to attack anyone. She's just telling the truth. Elaine's eyes flashed. Don't patronize me, Jared. You don't know what it's like to have your own daughter twist you into some character in a book. I never named you, I said calmly. I didn't have to. The feeling was the story. Raymond opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked older than he had an hour ago. Jared turned to me. I honestly thought you had it easier. And he said, his voice low. No expectations, no pressure. I used to envy that. I blinked, stunned. You envied not being seen. He rubbed the back of his neck. It felt like you had space. I didn't realize that space came with silence. It did. And I said, years of it. Years of it. Talia placed her hand over mine. You're writing. It made me cry, Lena. Especially the story about the girl who mails her parents invitations they never open. I've thought about it every day since I read it. I just didn't know it was real. Elaine pushed her chair back abruptly. The scrape of it echoed against the floor. Excuse me, she said, voice brittle. I need to check on dessert. She left the room, her posture stiff, not looking at anyone. The conversation paused, then shifted, awkwardly as guests tried to fill the void with small talk, but no one was really listening. Jared glanced toward the kitchen, then back at me. She'll come around, he said eventually. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't feel the need to follow her or soften the truth. For once I hadn't bent myself to make others more comfortable Raymond finally spoke, voice quiet. I didn't know, Lana. I should have asked more, paid more attention. You should have, I said. Not cruel, just plainly, but now you do. He nodded once, the lines on his face deepening in the silence that followed. I realized this was the first time I'd ever seen my father look ashamed from across the table. Telia leaned in and whispered, I think they're finally hearing you, And for the first time in a long time, I believed someone meant it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a pale blue envelope with my father's handwriting, slanted, neat, careful. I stared at it for a while before opening it. Inside was a single page. Lena, I finished your book twice, actually. Once to follow the story and again to listen for your voice in it. I'm sorry it took me so long to hear you. Your writing is beautiful, it matters, and so do you love Dad. I sat with it in hand, stunned by the quietness of it. No grand gestures, just the truth at last. Jared called that weekend like he had every week since the dinner. Our conversations were still finding their rhythms. Some awkward silences, some unspoken guilt, but they were real. He asked questions now about my work, my deadlines, my next book. Actually, he said that Sunday, Talia and I were wondering if you'd do a short reading at the engagement party. Something from your book, just a few minutes. I hesitated, caught between the instinct to shrink and the urge to rise. I'd love to, I said. When I arrived at the party, the backyard was strung with lights. The tables were dressed in navy and gold. My name card wasn't at the edge this time. It sat at the center. Table 1 beside Jared and Talia and across from my parents. Elaine looked up when I approached. Her smile was brief, brittle, but it held at you look nice, she said, eyes flicking to my dress. Thanks, I replied, not pushing for more. The seat was cushioned, the air warm. Talia handed me a glass of champagne, her expression soft. We're glad you're here, she said. And for the first time in a long time, I believed she meant it. I stood at the small podium near the garden path, string lights glowing overhead, a soft breeze carrying the scent of hydrangeas and lemon cake. My hands trembled only slightly as I opened the book and found the marked page. I want to share a passage, I said, scanning the faces before me. Guests from both families, neighbors, old friends. My eyes caught Jared's, then Talia's. Both gave small nods. I began. En bokatevsting crepes, I keth embasses. I make as may, I begounce, I beg expastization. Knave the en, my that's the first, and thasly. I noke thee as thus, with a cumbria their seers. Not. It was a piece about daughters reclaiming their names, how some names are erased in the margins of family stories, and how writing them back in takes time, courage, and ink no one can wash away. I read slowly, carefully, not performing, just telling the truth in my own rhythm. When I finished, the silence held for a moment, longer than I expected. Then soft applause, then louder. A ripple of appreciation. I stepped down, heart thudding. Talia's mother came up first. I teach contemporary literature at Crestwell College, she said warmly. My students read your work. You give them something they don't get anywhere else. Something honest. Thank you, I said, stunned later. As guests wandered to dessert, I caught sight of Elaine near the buffet table. She was dabbing at the corner of one eye with a cocktail napkin. When she noticed me watching, She turned away slightly, said nothing, but she didn't leave the room. After the party, I was gathering my things when Raymond approached. He looked tired but lighter somehow. "That piece," he said, voice low, "was powerful. Thanks, Dad." He leaned in, giving me a hug more solid than any I could remember then, in a whisper meant only for me. "Your mother stayed up reading last night." She didn't say much, but she kept turning the pages. I held that sentence in my chest, quietly. Not a resolution, not a rewrite of the past, but maybe the beginning of a new chapter. Epilogue. The shelf, back in Brooklyn. The city noise racked around me like an old coat, familiar, a little frayed, but still mine. I was sorting through mail when I saw the padded envelope with my mother's handwriting on the label. My breath caught inside was a printed photo, slightly grainy, taken from the hallway of my childhood home. It was the living room shelf, the one that used to be reserved for Jared's trophies and framed certificates. Only now my books sat beside them, thin spaces, the anthology, even the galley of my upcoming novel. Tucked behind the photo was a short note on floral stationery. "Lena, I didn't understand what I threw away. I'm reading now, Mom." I didn't cry. I didn't rush to respond. I just stood there for a long moment holding the paper like it was something fragile and strange. Then I walked to my desk and placed the note beside the draft of my next manuscript. It didn't erase the silence or the years it filled, but maybe quietly it was enough to begin.